The blood-soaked letter trembled in Harriet Eastwood's hands as the stagecoach rumbled toward Deming, New Mexico territory. Her husband's final words, scrawled in haste before outlaws had gunned him down, contained the devastating news that their trading post had been raided and burned to the ground. Harriet pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling the child within her stir as if sensing her distress. 5 months pregnant and now a widow, she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to in this harsh frontier land. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life that had brought Harriet and Thomas West from Boston now seemed like a cruel joke. The stagecoach hit a particularly deep rut, jostling the passengers. Harriet winced, clutching the wooden seat beneath her. "First time to Deming, madam?" asked an elderly woman seated across from her, noting Harriet's fine but travel-worn dress. "Yes," Harriet replied, tucking the letter away. "My husband had a trading post near Silver City, but there was trouble." The woman's eyes softened with understanding. "Out here, trouble usually meant only one thing: violence." "I'm sorry for your loss, dear. It's not easy for a woman alone in these parts." Harriet nodded, swallowing back tears. She would not cry, not here in front of strangers. She had wept enough since receiving the letter 3 weeks ago, delivered by a sympathetic army lieutenant who'd found Thomas's body. Now, she needed to be strong for her unborn child. The stagecoach arrived in Deming just as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent. The small frontier town was dusty but bustling, with the newly constructed Southern Pacific Railroad having brought an influx of activity. Harriet gathered her single carpetbag, all she had left in the world, and stepped down carefully from the coach. The driver handed her down the small trunk containing the remnants of her former life. "Town's got a decent hotel just down the street, madam," he offered, noting her obvious condition and tired appearance. "Thank you." Harriet attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her funds were limited enough for perhaps a week's lodging and meals if she was frugal. After that, she had no idea what she would do. As she stood uncertain on the wooden sidewalk, the busy activity of the frontier town swirled around her. Cowboys rode past, merchants called out their wares, and somewhere a piano played a tinny tune. She felt invisible among the rush, a woman with no place and no purpose. "Madam, are you all right?" The voice came from behind her. Harriet turned to find a tall man regarding her with concern. His weathered face suggested years under the harsh western sun, though he couldn't have been more than 35. A star-shaped badge glinted on his vest. "I'm fine, thank you, Marshal," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "Xavier Davenport," he introduced himself, tipping his hat. "And you don't look fine, if you'll pardon my saying so. You look like someone who's just arrived with nowhere to go." His directness caught her off guard. Back east, such bluntness would have been considered unforgivably rude. Here in the West, she was learning that people spoke their minds. "Harriet Eastwood," she responded, "and you're right. I've just arrived from Boston by way of Silver City." The marshal's eyes narrowed slightly. "Silver City, there was trouble up that way recently." "Yes," Harriet said simply, "my husband's trading post." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Thomas Eastwood was your husband?" Harriet nodded, surprised. "You knew him?" "We met a few times when he came through Deming for supplies," Xavier replied, his expression softening. "He was a good man. I was sorry to hear what happened." The simple acknowledgement of her loss threatened to undo Harriet's carefully maintained composure. She blinked rapidly, looking away. "Do you have family here? Someone expecting you?" Xavier asked. "No," Harriet admitted. "I have no one now." Xavier Davenport studied her for a moment, noting her condition, the quality of her clothes fine but practical, and the dignified way she held herself despite her obvious distress. "I know someone who might be able to help," he said finally. "The widow Carson runs a boarding house for respectable women. It's clean, safe, and more affordable than the hotel. If you'd allow me, I can escort you there." Harriet hesitated. In Boston, accepting help from a strange man would be unthinkable. But she was no longer in Boston, and her options were severely limited. "That's very kind of you, Marshal Davenport." He picked up her trunk with ease. "This way, Mrs. Eastwood, it's not far." They walked in silence down the main street, Harriet acutely aware of curious glances cast their way. A woman in her condition, walking with the town marshal, was bound to start tongues wagging. The Carson boarding house was a two-story adobe and wood structure with a small sign hanging from the porch. As they approached, a girl of about 8 came racing around the side of the house, her dark braids flying behind her. "Papa," she called out, skidding to a stop when she noticed Harriet. "Oh, hello, Emma, where are your manners?" Xavier chided gently. "This is Mrs. Eastwood, she's new to town." The girl Emma gave a small curtsy that was endearingly awkward. "Pleased to meet you, madam." Harriet couldn't help but smile at the child's earnest attempt at formality. "It's nice to meet you too, Emma." "Is Mrs. Carson in?" Xavier asked his daughter. "Yes, she's in the kitchen making preserves," Emma replied, her attention now fixed on Harriet's midsection. "Are you going to have a baby, Emma?" Xavier said sharply. "It's all right," Harriet assured him. To the girl she said, "Yes, I am. In about 4 more months." Emma's eyes widened. "Is your husband here too?" Harriet felt her throat tighten. "No, my husband. He died recently." The girl's face fell. "Oh, like my mama did when I was little." Xavier placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Emma, why don't you run ahead and tell Mrs. Carson we're coming?" The girl nodded and dashed up the steps, disappearing through the front door. "I apologize for my daughter's questions," Xavier said as they followed more slowly. "She's at an age where curiosity outweighs propriety." "There's no need for apology," Harriet replied. "Children should be curious. And she seems like a lovely girl." A small, proud smile crossed the marshal's face. "She's a handful sometimes, but yes, she is." The interior of the boarding house was modestly furnished but immaculately clean. A plump woman with silver-streaked black hair emerged from the back, wiping her hands on an apron. Emma stood beside her, still studying Harriet with interest. "Marshal Davenport," the woman greeted him warmly. "Emma says you've brought a visitor, Mrs. Carson. This is Mrs. Eastwood. She's just arrived from back east and needs lodging. I thought of your establishment." Mrs. Carson's shrewd eyes took in Harriet's condition and the simple gold band on her left hand. "Thomas Eastwood's widow?" she asked directly. Harriet nodded, impressed by how quickly news traveled. "Yes, madam." The older woman's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, child. News of the raid reached us last week. A terrible business." "Thank you," Harriet murmured. "Do you have a room available, Mrs. Carson?" Xavier asked. "For Thomas Eastwood's widow, of course." She gestured for Harriet to follow her. "I have a small room at the back of the house. It gets good light in the mornings and is away from the street noise." As the women moved toward the stairs, Xavier set down Harriet's trunk. "I should get back to my rounds," he said. "Emma, you come along with me. Let Mrs. Eastwood get settled." "But Papa," Emma protested, "I want to stay and talk to Mrs. Eastwood." "There'll be time for that later," Xavier told his daughter firmly. "Mrs. Eastwood is tired from her journey." Harriet, touched by the girl's interest, knelt slightly to address her. "Perhaps you could visit me tomorrow, Emma. I'd enjoy the company." Emma's face lit up. "Can I, Papa, please?" Xavier's stern expression melted into resignation. "If Mrs. Carson and Mrs. Eastwood don't mind, you may visit tomorrow afternoon after your schoolwork is done." "I don't mind at all," Harriet assured him. "Very well then." He tipped his hat to the women. "Ladies, good afternoon." As he turned to leave, Harriet called after him, "Marshal Davenport." When he turned back, she said simply, "Thank you." He nodded once and departed, his daughter skipping alongside him down the boardwalk. Mrs. Carson led Harriet to a small but pleasant room on the second floor. "It's not fancy," the older woman apologized, "but it's clean and quiet." "It's perfect," Harriet assured her, sinking gratefully onto the edge of the narrow bed. After weeks of travel in crowded stage coaches and noisy hotels, the simple room felt like a sanctuary. "Dinner's at 6, Mrs. Carson informed her. "There are 4 other ladies boarding here, 2 schoolteachers, a milliner, and a young woman who works at the telegraph office, all respectable." Harriet nodded her understanding. In a frontier town, a woman's reputation was perhaps her most valuable possession. "Mrs. Carson," Harriet said as the older woman turned to leave, "I should tell you that my funds are limited. I can pay for 2 weeks' lodging now, but after that." The landlady regarded her thoughtfully. "Let's not worry about that just yet. Rest today, and tomorrow we'll think about what's to be done." Left alone, Harriet finally allowed the tears to come. She wept silently for Thomas, for their lost future, and for the child who would never know its father. When no more tears would come, she washed her face with water from the pitcher on the washstand and unpacked her few belongings. Among them was a daguerreotype of Thomas taken just before they'd left Boston. His serious expression belied the excitement he'd felt about their western adventure. "There's a fortune to be made out west, Hattie," he'd told her, "and it's a fine place to raise a family." She placed the picture on the small bedside table and changed into a clean dress for dinner. As she made her way downstairs, she silently vowed that somehow she would make a life here for herself and her child. Thomas had believed in the promise of the West, and she would honor his memory by finding a way to survive here. The days passed quickly at the boarding house. Harriet met the other boarders, all of whom were kind but busy with their own affairs. Emma Davenport, true to her word, appeared the day after Harriet's arrival and became a frequent visitor. The girl was bright and talkative, full of stories about Deming and its inhabitants. "Papa says you're from Boston," Emma said one afternoon as she helped Harriet fold laundry. "What's it like there? Are there real theaters like in the books?" "Yes, there are theaters and museums and parks with lovely fountains," Harriet replied, smiling at the girl's enthusiasm. "It sounds beautiful," Emma sighed. "I've never been anywhere but here in Santa Fe." "Deming has its own kind of beauty," Harriet observed. "The sunsets here are more magnificent than any I saw in Boston." The truth was, Harriet was beginning to appreciate the stark beauty of the New Mexico territory. The vast open spaces, the dramatic mountains in the distance, the astonishing clarity of the air, all were so different from the crowded, sooty streets of Boston. But appreciating the landscape didn't solve her practical problems. Her funds were dwindling, and she needed to find a way to support herself. She could sew tolerably well, but not well enough to work as a seamstress. Her education was solid, but not specialized enough to secure a position as a teacher. One evening, about 10 days after her arrival, Xavier Davenport appeared at the boarding house door. Harriet happened to be in the front parlor, reading to Emma from a book of poetry the girl had brought from home. "Marshal Davenport," she said, surprised by his appearance. "Emma and I were just reading Tennyson." Xavier looked uncomfortable in the feminine surroundings of the parlor, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Eastwood, I wondered if I might have a word with you, in private." Harriet felt a flutter of anxiety. Had there been news about Thomas's killers? Or perhaps there was some problem with her staying in town. "Of course," she replied, setting aside the book. "Emma, perhaps you could ask Mrs. Carson if she has any of those molasses cookies you like." When the girl had departed on her errand, Harriet turned to Xavier. "Is something wrong, Marshal?" "No, nothing's wrong." He cleared his throat. "I've come with a proposition for you." Harriet raised her eyebrows, waiting. "I understand from Mrs. Carson that you're looking for a way to support yourself," he continued. "And I find myself in need of someone to look after Emma and the house while I'm working." Harriet blinked in surprise. "You're offering me a position as your housekeeper," "As Emma's governess," he clarified. "And yes, to manage the household. We have a woman who comes in twice a week to do the heavy cleaning, but Emma needs someone there all the time, someone educated who can help with her lessons and—" He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "Someone to teach her the things a girl should know, things a father can't teach." Harriet considered the offer. It would solve her immediate problem of financial support, but living in an unmarried man's home would be scandalous, even with her status as a widow. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. "I know it's an unusual arrangement, but I can provide separate quarters for you, a small cabin behind the main house that was originally built as a mother-in-law cottage." He hesitated. "And when your time comes, you'll need help with the baby. Emma is old enough to be useful, and Mrs. Granger, our twice-weekly help, is experienced with birthing." The practical considerations were compelling. Harriet had been wondering how she would manage a newborn alone. "It's a generous offer, Marshal Davenport," she said carefully, "but I'm concerned about appearances." a pregnant widow living in the home of the town marshal. Not in my home, he corrected, in the cottage behind it, and as for appearances, he looked uncomfortable again. This is the frontier, Mrs. Eastwood. Practical arrangements sometimes take precedence over social niceties. But if it helps, Reverend Willis and his wife live just across the street. Their presence should satisfy any concerns about propriety. Harriet considered the offer. The position would provide shelter, income, and assistance when the baby came, all things she desperately needed. And she had grown fond of Emma over the past days. "May I see the cottage before I decide?" she asked. "Of course, I can take you there now if you're available." Harriet fetched her shawl and they walked the short distance to Xavier's home, a modest but well-maintained house on the edge of town. Behind it stood a small cabin, just as he'd described. The cottage was simple but sound, with a main room that served as bedroom and sitting area, a tiny kitchen, and a small covered porch. It was furnished sparsely but adequately. "Emma and I built the porch last summer," Xavier explained, showing her around. "And there's a good well between the buildings, so you won't have to carry water far." Harriet walked through the space, mentally arranging where a cradle would fit. The cottage was small, but it would be her own space, a place to start rebuilding her life. "What would my duties be exactly?" she asked. "Emma attends the town school during the day, but she needs supervision with her studies in the evenings. She also needs—" Xavier looked uncomfortable again. "Guidance. In becoming a young lady, I do my best, but there are things I don't know how to teach her. And the household management, meals for the three of us, keeping the house in order between Mrs. Granger's visits, household accounts, nothing too strenuous, especially in your condition." Harriet nodded slowly. "And the compensation?" Xavier named a figure that was modest but fair, particularly considering the cottage would be provided without charge. "When would you want me to start?" "As soon as you're able. Emma's been asking about you daily since your arrival." Harriet smiled at that. The girl's eager affection had been one of the few bright spots in these difficult weeks. "I'll need to discuss this with Mrs. Carson and give her proper notice," Harriet said, "but if all is agreeable, I could move in next Monday." Relief washed over Xavier's face. "That would be fine, more than fine." As they walked back to the boarding house, Harriet found herself curious about the marshal's past. "Emma mentioned that her mother passed away when she was young." Xavier's expression tightened. "Yes, Emma was just 3. Sarah, my wife, caught fever after helping nurse folks during an epidemic. By the time we realized how sick she was, it was too late." "I'm sorry," Harriet said softly. "It must have been difficult raising Emma alone." "It has been," he admitted, "but she's a good girl. Strong-willed like her mother, but good-hearted." They walked in silence for a moment before Xavier spoke again. "Mrs. Eastwood, I should tell you something about Emma. She tends to form attachments quickly. She misses having a mother, though she barely remembers Sarah. I don't want you to be uncomfortable if she becomes overly fond of you." Harriet considered this. "I understand and I appreciate your concern, but children are resilient, Marshal Davenport. As long as we're honest with her about my role, I think we can navigate her feelings appropriately." Xavier nodded, looking relieved. "Thank you for understanding." They had reached the boarding house. As Xavier prepared to take his leave, he hesitated. "One more thing, Mrs. Eastwood. If you're to be living on my property and working in my home, I think it would be appropriate for you to call me Xavier. Marshal Davenport seems overly formal for our arrangement." Harriet smiled slightly. "Then you must call me Harriet." "Harriet," he repeated, the name sounding strangely intimate in his deep voice. "Until Monday, then." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. For the first time since receiving Thomas's letter, Harriet felt a small spark of hope. Perhaps she could build a life here after all. Mrs. Carson was surprisingly supportive of Harriet's decision to accept Xavier's offer. "The marshal is a good man," she declared when Harriet explained the arrangement. "And that girl of his needs a woman's influence. She's running wild as a colt." "I'm not sure how much influence I'll have," Harriet confessed. "I've never raised a child before." "You'll learn," Mrs. Carson said confidently, "and having Emma around will be good practice for when your little one arrives." The other boarders were equally encouraging. The though the milliner, Miss Jenkins, couldn't resist a teasing comment. The marshal is considered quite a catch in Deming, you know, widowed 5 years and never shown interest in remarrying despite several ladies' best efforts. I'm not interested in marriage, Harriet said firmly. I'm accepting a position as a governess and housekeeper, nothing more. Miss Jenkins just smiled knowingly, which Harriet chose to ignore. On Monday morning, Xavier arrived with a wagon to transport Harriet's trunk and few belongings to the cottage. Emma accompanied him, practically bouncing with excitement. I helped Papa clean the cottage yesterday, she announced as Harriet settled into the wagon beside her. And I picked wildflowers to put on the table for you. That was very thoughtful, Emma, Harriet said, touched by the girl's enthusiasm. The move itself was simple enough. Harriet had few possessions to arrange. By early afternoon, she was settled in the cottage, and Emma was giving her a grand tour of the main house. This is the kitchen, the girl announced, showing Harriet a clean, well-organized space. Papa's not much of a cook. He can make bacon and beans, but that's about all. Then I suppose we'll have to expand the menu, Harriet said with a smile. Emma's face lit up. Could you make pie? Mama used to make apple pie, Papa says, but he can't remember the recipe. I can certainly try, Harriet promised. I make a decent apple pie, though I don't know if it's the same as your mother's. Emma led her through the rest of the house, a comfortable sitting room with well-worn furniture, a small study where Xavier apparently handled paperwork from his marshal duties, and upstairs, 2 bedrooms. Emma's room was tidy but personalized with treasures only a child would value: pretty rocks, a bird's nest, a doll with a faded dress. Papa's room is across the hall, Emma explained, but he says I'm not to show it to you because it's private. Harriet suppressed a smile at this evidence of Xavier's modesty. That's quite right. Everyone should have some private space. By the time Xavier returned home that evening, Harriet had prepared a simple but hearty meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread she'd baked that afternoon. The transformation of his kitchen and dining table wasn't lost on him. This looks amazing, he said, removing his hat as he entered the house. We haven't had a proper meal like this since. Since Mama, Emma finished for him. She turned to Harriet, her eyes shining. It smells just like when Mama was here. An awkward silence fell. Harriet didn't want to replace the girl's mother in her memory, but neither did she want to dismiss Emma's feelings. Food has a way of bringing back memories, she said gently. It's nice that you remember your mother's cooking. Xavier gave her a grateful look for navigating the moment gracefully. Shall we eat before it gets cold? That first meal established a pattern for the days that followed. Emma would go to school while Xavier performed his duties as marshal. Harriet would tend to the house, prepare meals, and occasionally walk into town for supplies or to visit Mrs. Carson. In the evenings, the 3 would eat together, and afterward, Harriet would help Emma with her lessons while Xavier caught up on paperwork or made minor repairs around the property. It was a surprisingly comfortable routine, one that suited Harriet's practical nature. As her pregnancy progressed, Xavier insisted that she rest more and allow Mrs. Granger to take on additional tasks. You're working too hard, he told her one evening, finding her mending one of Emma's dresses despite the visible fatigue on her face. Nonsense, Harriet protested. I'm perfectly capable of basic sewing. Xavier took the mending from her hands and set it aside. You're 7 months pregnant, Harriet. You need to rest. His concern was touching, but Harriet was determined not to become a burden. I'm being careful, Xavier, but I need to earn my keep. His expression softened. You more than earn your keep. Emma is happier than I've seen her in years. The house feels like a home again, and I'm not eating my own terrible cooking. If anything, I should be paying you more. Harriet felt a blush rising to her cheeks at his praise. Over the past months, she'd grown increasingly aware of Xavier as a man rather than simply her employer. He was unfailingly kind, respectful of her space and privacy, and showed a gentleness with Emma that moved Harriet deeply. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. There was something in his gaze that made her heart beat faster, something she wasn't ready to acknowledge or name. As her time grew nearer, Harriet began preparing for the baby's arrival. Xavier had a cradle delivered, a beautiful piece crafted by the town's furniture maker. Emma helped sew simple garments and blankets for the baby, her stitches improving under Harriet's patient guidance. One evening in early July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emma asked the question Harriet had been anticipating. "What will the baby call you?" "Mama, I suppose," Harriet answered, resting a hand on her rounded belly. "Or Mother when they're older." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "And what will the baby call Papa?" Xavier, who had been whittling a small wooden horse, looked up sharply. "Emma, nothing," Harriet said gently, cutting off Xavier's response. "The baby won't call Xavier anything special because he's not the baby's father." Emma's brow furrowed. "But you live here with us, and you take care of me like a mama, so isn't Papa like a father to your baby?" The innocent logic of the child's question caught Harriet off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Xavier intervened. "Emma, it's time for you to wash up for bed. Go on now." When the girl had gone inside, an uncomfortable silence fell between the adults. Finally, Xavier spoke. "I apologize for Emma's question. She doesn't understand the arrangement we have." "She's a child," Harriet said, staring at the darkening horizon. "She sees things simply. To her, we're all living together as a family, so naturally your role would extend to my child." Xavier set aside his whittling and turned to face her directly. "And how do you see our arrangement, Harriet?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Harriet had come to cherish their evenings together, to value Xavier's quiet strength and unwavering support. But she was still a woman in mourning, still carrying another man's child. "I'm grateful for the position, for the home you've provided for me and my child," she said carefully. "And I've grown fond of Emma, very fond." "And of me," Xavier pressed, his voice low. Harriet felt her cheeks warm. "Xavier, a sharp pain cut off her words, radiating across her abdomen. She gasped, clutching at her belly. Xavier was immediately on his feet. "Harriet, what is it?" "Just a pain," she said, trying to sound calm. "It's probably not." Another pain, stronger this time, made her inhale sharply. Xavier knelt before her, his face etched with concern. "Is it the baby? Is it coming?" "I think so," Harriet admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "But it's too early." "Almost a month too early." Xavier was already moving. "I'll fetch Mrs. Granger and the doctor." "Emma," he called, striding toward the house. "Emma, come help Mrs. Eastwood to her bed." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Mrs. Granger arrived quickly, her capable hands and calm demeanor a reassuring presence. The doctor came soon after, his expression grave when he examined Harriet. "The baby's coming, and there's no stopping it now," he announced. "Mrs. Eastwood, I need you to be strong." "Premature births can be difficult." Harriet nodded, too caught in the grip of another contraction to speak. Through the haze of pain, she was aware of Xavier pacing outside the cottage, of Emma being sent to stay with the minister's wife across the street, of Mrs. Granger murmuring encouragements as she wiped Harriet's brow with a cool cloth. The labor was long and arduous. As night deepened, Harriet's strength began to flag. The doctor's expression grew increasingly concerned as he monitored her progress. "She's weakening," he murmured to Mrs. Granger. "And the baby's heartbeat is slowing." Harriet heard his words through a fog of exhaustion. Fear gripped her, not for herself, but for her child, Thomas's child, the only piece of him she had left. "Please," she whispered, "please save my baby." The doctor approached the bed, his face serious. "Mrs. Eastwood, I need you to push with everything you have when the next pain comes. The baby needs to come now." Harriet nodded, gathering what remained of her strength. When the next contraction came, she pushed with every ounce of will and determination she possessed, a cry tearing from her throat. And then, miraculously, a new cry filled the room, thin and reedy, but unmistakably the wail of a newborn. "A girl," the doctor announced, his voice filled with relief. "Small, but she has good lungs." Tears streamed down Harriet's face as Mrs. Granger placed the tiny, wrapped bundle in her arms. Her daughter was indeed small, with a shock of dark hair and a face red from the effort of her arrival. "She's beautiful," Harriet whispered, tracing a finger along the baby's cheek. "Perfect." The doctor's expression remained concerned. She's very small, Mrs. Eastwood. The next few days will be critical. She'll need warmth and regular feeding if she's to thrive. Harriet nodded, determination replacing her exhaustion. She'll thrive, I'll make sure of it. After the doctor left, Mrs. Granger helped Harriet clean up and change into a fresh nightgown. The marshal's been wearing a path in the dirt outside, she reported with a smile. Should I tell him the news? Yes, please, Harriet said, adjusting her position to better hold her daughter. Moments later, a hesitant knock sounded at the door. Harriet, may I come in? Yes, Xavier, he entered cautiously, as if afraid of intruding on a sacred space. His eyes immediately found the tiny bundle in Harriet's arms, and his expression softened. You have a daughter, Harriet said, smiling despite her exhaustion. Xavier approached the bed slowly, his gaze fixed on the infant. She's so small, but strong, Harriet assured him, like her father was. A flicker of something pain, disappointment, crossed Xavier's face before being replaced by a warm smile. What will you name her? Harriet looked down at her daughter. Sarah, she said softly. Sarah Thomas Eastwood. Xavier's head jerked up, his eyes widening. Sarah, after your wife, Harriet confirmed. I hope you don't mind. Emma has spoken of her mother so often, with such love, that the name seemed right somehow. Xavier's eyes glistened suspiciously in the lamplight. I don't mind at all, it's a beautiful name. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, both watching the sleeping infant. Finally, Xavier spoke. Mrs. Granger has agreed to stay the night, just in case you or Sarah need anything, and the doctor will return in the morning. Thank you, Harriet said sincerely. For everything you've done. Xavier shook his head. There's no need for thanks between. He trailed off, seemingly uncertain how to define their relationship. Friends, Harriet supplied with a small smile. We are friends, aren't we, Xavier? Yes, he said, though something in his expression suggested he might have chosen a different word. Friends. He rose to leave. You should rest now. I'll bring Emma to meet Sarah tomorrow if you're feeling up to visitors. I'd like that, Harriet said, already feeling her eyelids grow heavy. Xavier paused at the door. Harriet, I'm glad you're both safe. The days following Sarah's birth were anxious ones. The tiny girl struggled to nurse at first, causing Harriet endless worry, but with Mrs. Granger's experienced guidance and the doctor's regular visits, Sarah slowly began to gain strength. By the end of the first week, the doctor pronounced her out of the woods, though still requiring careful attention. Emma was enchanted with the baby from their first meeting. She's so tiny. She marveled, peering into the cradle. Like a little doll, but real. Would you like to hold her? Harriet offered, carefully lifting Sarah from her cradle. Emma's eyes widened. Could I, really? Sit here beside me, Harriet instructed, patting the bed. When Emma was settled, Harriet gently placed the baby in her arms, showing her how to support Sarah's head. Emma stared down at the infant with an expression of wonder. Hello, Sarah, she whispered. I'm Emma. I'm going to be your big sister. The declaration caught Harriet by surprise. She glanced up to find Xavier watching from the doorway, an unreadable expression on his face. Emma, he said gently. Remember what we discussed. Sarah is Mrs. Eastwood's baby. Emma looked confused, but we all live together. And you said family isn't always about blood, it's about love. Don't you love Mrs. Eastwood and Sarah? An awkward silence fell. Harriet focused intently on adjusting the baby's blanket, unable to meet Xavier's gaze. It's more complicated than that, Emma, Xavier finally said. Mrs. Eastwood works for us. She has her own life, her own family. But her husband died like Mama did, Emma persisted. And she doesn't have any other family, so why can't we be her family? Harriet finally looked up, finding Xavier's eyes on her. There was a question in his gaze, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Harriet said softly, redirecting the girl's attention. Family comes in many forms, and you're right that I don't have blood relatives here in Deming, but I have Sarah now, and I have friends like you and your father who have been very kind to me. Emma seemed to consider this. But if you married Papa, then we could all be a real family. Sarah would have a father and I would have a mother, and you and Papa wouldn't be lonely anymore. Emma, Xavier's voice was sharp with embarrassment. That's enough. Take Sarah back to Mrs. Eastwood and go to your lessons. Chastened, Emma carefully handed the baby back to Harriet and slipped from the room without another word. "I apologize," Xavier said once they were alone. "She doesn't understand how inappropriate her suggestions are." "She's a child who wants a mother," Harriet said gently. "It's natural for her to imagine solutions that would give her what she desires." Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Harriet had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "Still, I don't want you to think that I put such notions in her head, or that I expect anything beyond our current arrangement." Harriet looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, considering her words carefully. "What if I told you that I've thought about it too?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Xavier went very still. "About what? About us?" "About what it might be like if our arrangement were different." Harriet forced herself to meet his gaze. "I know it's too soon. Thomas has been gone less than a year, and I have Sarah to think of now, but I'd be lying if I said I haven't developed feelings for you, Xavier." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing all at once. Xavier took a step toward her, then stopped, as if uncertain of his welcome. "I've tried not to have feelings for you," he confessed. "It seemed wrong with you in mourning and expecting another man's child. But I've failed miserably at keeping my heart uninvolved." Harriet felt a flutter of hope mixed with apprehension. "Where does that leave us? In uncharted territory," Xavier admitted. "But perhaps we could allow ourselves to explore these feelings slowly and carefully." "For Emma's sake and for Sarah's and for our own," Harriet nodded, a small smile forming. "Slowly and carefully sounds wise." Xavier crossed the room to stand beside the bed. Gently, he reached out to touch Sarah's tiny hand where it had escaped the blanket. The infant reflexively grasped his finger, her small fist barely encircling it. "She has a strong grip for one so small," he observed, wonder in his voice. "Like her mother," Harriet said, watching the tender way Xavier interacted with her daughter. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the bed beside her. When she nodded, he sat carefully, mindful not to jostle the baby. Slowly, with deliberate care, he reached out and took Harriet's hand in his. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, "but I'd like to face it together if you're willing." Harriet squeezed his hand. "I'm willing." The summer passed in a haze of new parenthood and cautious courtship. Sarah grew stronger every day, her cheeks filling out and her cries becoming more robust. Harriet gradually resumed her duties in Xavier's household, though he insisted she do only what she felt capable of while caring for the infant. Emma proved to be an enthusiastic helper, eager to fetch diapers or rock Sarah when she fussed. Harriet observed with amusement how the girl studiously avoided mentioning marriage again, though she often created situations that left Xavier and Harriet alone together. "She's quite the little matchmaker," Harriet remarked one evening as they sat on the porch after Emma had gone to bed. Sarah slept peacefully in a basket at Harriet's feet, the mild summer night air soft on her small face. Xavier chuckled. "Subtle she is not, but her heart's in the right place." "It is," Harriet agreed, smiling fondly. "She's a remarkable child, Xavier. You've raised her well." "I've done my best," he said, his expression turning reflective. "But there's so much she needs that I can't provide, things only a mother can teach." The implication hung in the air between them. In the months since Sarah's birth, their relationship had deepened, their mutual affection growing more obvious by the day. Yet neither had spoken directly of marriage since that first conversation. "Xavier," Harriet began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about our arrangement." He turned to her, his expression cautious. "Oh, my position here was always intended to be temporary," she continued, "to see me through my pregnancy and Sarah's birth." A shadow crossed Xavier's face. "Are you saying you want to leave?" "No," Harriet said quickly, "not at all. But I think it's time we acknowledged that what's between us has become much more than an employer and employee relationship." Xavier reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "Much more," he agreed. "The thing is," Harriet continued, her heart racing, "I care deeply for you and for Emma. And I've seen how much you care for Sarah. We've become a family in all but name." "Yes, we have," Xavier said softly. Harriet took a deep breath. "So perhaps it's time we considered making it official, for the children's sake and for our own." For a moment Xavier didn't respond, and Harriet feared she'd been too forward. but then a slow smile spread across his face. "Harriet Eastwood," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "Are you proposing marriage to me?" Harriet felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I suppose I am." "Terribly improper of me, isn't it?" Xavier laughed, a full, joyous sound that Harriet realized she'd rarely heard from him. "Improper, perhaps, but welcome." His expression sobered. "Are you certain, though? It hasn't even been a year since Thomas." "I'll always honor Thomas's memory," Harriet said gently. "He'll always be Sarah's father, but he would want me to be happy to provide a stable home for our daughter." She squeezed Xavier's hand. "And I am happy here with you and Emma." Xavier's smile returned, brighter than before. "Then yes, Harriet, yes, I would be honored to marry you and to be a father to Sarah." He leaned forward and, with exquisite gentleness, kissed her for the first time. The touch of his lips on hers felt like a promise, like coming home after a long journey. When they parted, Xavier glanced down at the sleeping baby. "Do you think she'll accept me?" "As a father figure, I mean." "She already adores you," Harriet assured him. "And she'll grow up knowing about Thomas, about her birth father who loved her before she was even born." Xavier nodded, his expression solemn. "I promise to honor his memory to make sure she knows who he was." "I know you will," Harriet said softly. "It's one of the many reasons I love you." The words slipped out naturally, though she hadn't planned to say them. Xavier's eyes widened briefly before his face softened with emotion. "And I love you," he replied, the words a vow. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands entwined, watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. "Emma will be ecstatic," Xavier said eventually, a hint of amusement in his voice. Harriet laughed. "She'll be insufferably smug about her successful matchmaking. Should we tell her in the morning?" "Let's," Harriet agreed. "It seems cruel to make her wait when she's been hoping for this for months." As predicted, Emma's reaction the next morning was one of unbridled joy and not a small amount of self-satisfaction. "I knew it," she exclaimed, dancing around the kitchen. "I knew you would get married when." "Can I be in the wedding? Can I help plan it?" Xavier laughed at his daughter's enthusiasm. "Slow down, Emma, we haven't set a date yet." "Soon, though," Harriet said, smiling at the girl's excitement. "Perhaps in a few weeks, once we've had time to prepare." Emma suddenly grew serious, approaching Harriet where she sat feeding Sarah. "When you marry Papa, will you be my mama too?" The question, asked with such vulnerable hope, brought tears to Harriet's eyes. "Is that what you want, Emma?" The girl nodded solemnly. "More than anything." Harriet reached out with her free arm and pulled Emma close. "Then yes, I would be honored to be your mama too." Emma threw her arms around Harriet's neck, careful not to disturb the nursing baby. "I love you, Mama," she whispered over the girl's shoulder. Harriet met Xavier's gaze. His eyes were suspiciously bright as he watched his daughter embrace her soon-to-be stepmother. "I love you too, Emma," Harriet said, her voice thick with emotion. "Very much." The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a perfect September day. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the town's church with Reverend Willis officiating. Mrs. Carson cried openly throughout the service, declaring afterward that she'd known from the moment Xavier brought Harriet to her boarding house that they were destined for each other. Emma, resplendent in a new blue dress, proudly stood beside Harriet, holding baby Sarah throughout the ceremony. When Reverend Willis pronounced Xavier and Harriet husband and wife, Emma's cheer was the loudest in the church. The celebration afterward was a community affair, with seemingly the entire town turning out to wish the new family well. The women of Deming had prepared a feast, and someone had brought a fiddle to provide music for dancing. As the afternoon sun began to lower in the sky, Xavier found Harriet watching Emma, who was showing Sarah off to a group of admiring ladies. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around his new wife's waist. "Incredibly," Harriet replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be here now a widow remarried, with a baby and a stepdaughter, I would never have believed it." "Life has a way of surprising us," Xavier observed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes, wonderfully, for the better." They watched as Emma carried Sarah toward them, the baby awake and alert in her sister's careful arms. "Sarah's getting tired," Emma reported, "and hungry, I think." Thank you for taking such good care of her, Harriet said, accepting the infant from Emma's arms. You're a wonderful big sister. Emma beamed at the praise. Then, with the directness of childhood, she asked, Can I call you Mama now? For real? Harriet felt her heart swell with love for this earnest, caring girl who had been the first to welcome her to Deming. Yes, Emma, you can call me Mama now. Emma's face lit up with joy. She threw her arms around Harriet's waist, careful of the baby between them. I love you, Mama. I love you too, my sweet girl, Harriet replied, her voice thick with emotion. Over Emma's head, she met Xavier's gaze. His eyes shone with love and gratitude, mirroring the emotions overflowing in her own heart. In that moment, surrounded by her new family, Harriet felt a sense of peace and belonging she had feared lost forever after Thomas's death. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a good life, a blessed life filled with love and possibility. Emma released Harriet from her embrace and reached up to touch Sarah's cheek. The baby grasped her finger, gurgling contentedly. See, Sarah, Emma whispered to her sister. I told you it would work out. Now we're a real family. Xavier chuckled, ruffling his daughter's hair. When did you tell Sarah that? Emma's expression turned sheepish. Sometimes I would talk to her when she was still in Mama's tummy. I told her not to worry because we would take care of her. She looked up at Harriet, her eyes solemn. I promised her that even though her real papa was in heaven, my papa would be her papa too, and I would be her sister, and Mrs. Eastwood, Mama would take care of all of us. Harriet felt tears prick her eyes at the child's innocent faith. That was a beautiful promise, Emma. I'm going to keep it too, Emma declared, forever and ever. As the sun began to set over Deming, casting long golden shadows across the gathered community, Harriet looked around at the life she had found here, so different from what she had imagined when she'd first arrived, pregnant and alone, just 6 months ago. She had come west seeking a new beginning with Thomas, and though his journey had ended tragically, hers had continued. Through grief and uncertainty, she had found not just survival, but love, a new husband, a stepdaughter who had claimed her as Mama, and a community that had embraced her as one of their own. Forever and ever, she echoed softly, meeting Xavier's loving gaze over their daughters' heads. That sounds perfect. In the years that followed, the Davenport family thrived. Xavier continued to serve as marshal until 1885, when he was elected sheriff of Luna County. Harriet, respected for her practicality and compassion, became a leading figure in the community, eventually helping to establish Deming's first proper school. Emma grew into a poised and confident young woman, with her mother's determination and her father's sense of justice. Sarah, robust despite her early challenges, inherited her birth father's adventurous spirit and her stepfather's steady reliability. And when, in the spring of 1880, Harriet gave birth to twin boys named Thomas and Xavier, the family circle widened to embrace them with the same love that had healed their parents' grief and brought them together. The story of how they became a family was one told often around their dinner table, of a young widow who arrived in town pregnant and alone, of a little girl who took her hand and claimed her as Mama, and of a man who found the courage to love again. It wasn't always an easy story to tell. There were tears for those they had lost, acknowledgement of the pain that had preceded their joy. But it was their story, honest and true and ultimately triumphant, like the West itself. And in Deming, New Mexico territory, the house that had once echoed with loneliness became a home filled with laughter, love, and the beautiful chaos of family, a testament to the healing power of open hearts and second chances.